When William McKinley became the President of the United States in 1897, he presided over a country that was getting a little bit upset. What was it upset about? Well, it was the island to its south, Cuba, which at this point was a Spanish colony, and was also rebelling against said Spanish rule. This rebellion kicked off in 1895 and had some pretty unfortunate timing. I mean, rebellions are always pretty badly timed for those being rebelled against, but it coincided with the spectacular rise in American nationalism. When these ideas were combined with the stories about Spanish cruelties in Cuba, the American people got upset. As such, the people and the press wanted to do something about it, but McKinley wasn't too keen. It wasn't until the Spanish ambassador's criticisms of McKinley were made public that he opted to send a warship, the USS Maine, to Cuba in order to protect American interests. In February 1898, whilst in Havana Harbour, the Maine exploded, and irrespective of what the cause of the explosion was, the American people wanted blood. So bad was the public fervour and pressure from opponent politicians that McKinley knew war couldn't be avoided. And so on April the 21st, 1898, America did just that and declared war on Spain under the slogan of "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain." Now, Spain knew it wasn't going to defeat the United States in a war, but chose to fight it anyway. Why? Well, there were two main reasons. The first was that Cuba, along with the also revolting Philippines, were the last major vestiges of the once glorious Spanish Empire. And the second reason was that the dishonour of immediately surrendering to the US was too much for Spain to bear. Its leaders preferred to go down fighting and lose with its honour intact. So how did said fighting go? It went amazingly well. For America. You see, America opted to fight the war on two fronts, one in the south in Cuba and one in the east, or to the west technically, in the Philippines. This was where Commodore George Dewey decisively defeated the Spanish fleet there at the Battle of Manila Bay. The US Army then landed and brought over the exiled Filipino revolutionary Emilio Aguinaldo, who promptly declared Filipino independence. To bring the Philippines back into the fold, the Spanish launched a major fleet, hoping to dislodge the Americans. It was shortly after this that the US captured Guam, and by captured I mean they turned up and gave off a warning shot. Now traditionally, when nations were at peace, they would fire off a salute to each other. The Spanish garrison there didn't have any ammunition, and so the governor, who didn't know he was at war, promptly apologised for not returning the salute. The island was captured with no fighting. As for the Caribbean theatre, the US started by seizing some place in southern Cuba called Guantanamo Bay. It later landed an expeditionary force here and pushed inland. The Spanish retreated but were extremely adept at defensive tactics, and so American progress was slow until the primary American force landed on July the 1st. This was the force that contained the famous Rough Riders Volunteer Army led by a certain Theodore Roosevelt. The Americans advanced inland and fought a small Spanish force at the infamous Battle of San Juan Hill. Here, the Spanish were able to inflict many more casualties on the Americans than they themselves suffered before retreating. And in case you're wondering, it was this battle that made Theodore Roosevelt a household name. July the 3rd saw the largest naval battle of the war, the Battle of Santiago de Cuba, during which the Americans obliterated the Spanish fleet there. It was after this that the aforementioned relief force that was being sent to the Philippines was promptly turned around because the Spanish coast now lay undefended. Puerto Rico was invaded in late July, but Spanish forces there were incredibly difficult to dislodge. By mid-August, the Americans had captured Santiago, the second largest city in Cuba, and in the Philippines the Spanish governor had surrendered as well. With their forces on the run and much of their navy sitting at the bottom of the ocean, the Spanish sued for peace before the Americans could march on Havana. In December, a peace treaty was signed in which Spain lost Guam, the Philippines and Puerto Rico to the United States. Cuba became a US protectorate until 1902 when it gained its independence. In conclusion, the war had gone exceptionally well for America, which is why the Secretary of State John Hay called it a splendid little war. America's naval prowess were made clear to the world, and not a great deal of soldiers died in combat. Of course, lots of soldiers died from disease, but since yellow fever didn't wear a Spanish uniform, they didn't count. And for Spain, the soldiers who fought on Cuba and the Philippines had shown themselves as being some of the best in the world. But of course, the shock to Spanish society for losing the colony of Cuba was absolutely massive. The Spanish Empire was dead, the American Empire was born. I hope you enjoyed this episode and thank you for watching, with extra thanks to these patrons you can see on screen for their continued support. And an extra special thanks to James Bizanet, David Archaeologist, Azarka Flash, Danny Maloney, Party Boyko, Kulin Castleman, Rob Waterhouse, Chris Wicker, Gustav Swan, David Silverman, Winston Kaywood, Christian Cheke, Maggie Paxkowski, Lexi Schwinn, Anthony Beckett, Robert Wetzel, Sky Chappelle, Ike, Spinning Three Plates, Aaron the White and Michael Reynolds.
Good day everyone, I am JJ Rosas, and today I'm going to discuss to all of you about the orderly summary of the key points from the proclamation of President McKinley issued on December 21, 1898. The destruction of the Spanish fleet and cession of the Philippines. The U.S. Navy under Rear Admiral Dewey destroyed the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay, leading to the surrender of Spanish forces in the Philippines. Following the Treaty of Paris on December 10, 1898, Spain ceded the Philippines to the United States, official ending Spanish sovereignty. Need for immediate occupation and administration. The U.S. military government, which had been established in Manila, was to be extended across the entire Philippines archipelago. The United States was now responsible for the governance and administration of the Philippines. The third is U.S. authority and responsibility. The U.S. governance would assume sovereignty for over the Philippines, replacing Spanish political relations with a new American governance. The U.S. was tasked with securing the lives, property, and rights of the Filipino people. The military commander was to proclaim that the U.S. came not as invaders but as protectors of people's home, employment, and rights. Number 4 is the cooperation with the U.S. government. Filipinos who's cooperated with the U.S. government, whether through active aid or honest submission, would be protected and supported by U.S. states. Those who resisted would be brought under U.S. rule with firmness but without excessive severity. Fifth is to continue of local laws. Local laws regarding private rights, property, and crime would remain in force to be enforced by the existing tribunals as much as possible. Civil and municipal government function would be carried out by the officers who accepted U.S. sovereignty or Filipinos who pledged allegiance to the U.S. The number 6 is respect for private property. Private property, whether owned by individuals or corporation, would be respected by the U.S. government except in cases where there was a justified cost. Taxes previously paid to Spain would now be paid to U.S. authorities unless new rates or system were established. Number 7 is compensation for properly taken for military use. If private property was requisitioned for military purposes, fair compensation would be paid in cash or receipt would be issued if payment in cash was not feasible. Number 8 is opening of ports to trade. U.S.-controlled ports in the Philippines would be open to trade with all friendly nations. Goods not restricted for military reasons would be allowed entry, subject to custom duties and charges in force at the time. Goal to win Filipino confidence. The U.S. military administration aimed to earn the trust, respect, and affection of Filipino people by ensuring their individual rights and liberties. The mission was not to replace arbitrary rule with justice and rights, offering goods governance under the U.S. flag. And last but not the least is to strong governance and ensure stability. While pursuing the welfare of the people, the U.S. military government would maintain strong authority to prevent disturbance and ensure stable governance. In summary, President McKinley's proclamation emphasized the U.S. commitment to governing the Philippines after the Spanish-American War, focusing on protection, justice, respect for private property, and introduction of American sovereignty.
I am Harry Differentia. I'll be the one to discuss the events that brought Americans to the Philippines. What were the events that brought the Americans to the Philippines? The events that lead to Americans' involvement in the Philippines were a result of both economic needs and diplomatic tensions, primarily with Spain. Number one is economic growth and need for new markets. After the American Civil War, the U.S. economy experienced rapid growth, leading to an oversupply of products and capital. American industries needed new markets to absorb this surplus rather, as Senator Albert Beverages articulated, we must obey our blood and occupy new markets and if necessary new lands. American factories are more than the American people can use. American soil is producing more than they can consume. Fate has written our policy for us. The trade of the world must and shall be ours. The use needed to occupy new markets and if necessary new lands articulated by Senator Albert Beveridge. This need for economic expansion pushed the US to move away from its isolationist policy. In short, to move away from their alliances and other international, political, and economic relations. Second was imperialism and the search for weak colonizers. With many countries already under European colonial control, the US needed to identify a weak colonial power to target, which is Spain, which controlled several territories, including the Philippines, was deemed the most vulnerable among the colonial powers. Thus, it was imperative for America to come up with a plan on how to acquire colonies that would serve as her economic dumping ground. Pero where would she get her colony when almost all countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America were already owned by various European colonizers at the time? At the time, she adopted an imperial policy. It was necessary then for the United States na studihan kung unsang mga colonizer could not fight a sustainable war if ever they would declare it against that country. It turned out in that study that Spain was the weakest among the colonizers. American imperialists then started designing steps kung paano to make these American-Spanish relations deteriorate or to become impaired in quality, functioning, or condition as to justify the declaration of war against Spain and take its colonies or mga nasasakupan. The third, deteriorating relations with Spain. The US began to take actions that would heighten tensions with Spain. One significant event was the publication of a letter by Spanish Ambassador Jupoy de Lome, which criticized US President William McKinley. This letter enraged the American public and further sourced relations. Additionally, American media spread rumors about the mistreatment of American citizens in Cuba, a Spanish colony, fueling a anti-Spanish sentiment. So this was part of their plan. The first things that made Spanish-American relations deteriorate was the publication of the letter of Spanish ambassador to the United States, Dupoy de Lumi. This letter contained de Lome's personal criticism among the U.S. President William McKinley. In addition, American propaganda also spread rumors that American citizens in Cuba or another Spanish colony under the Spanish colony were being maltreated by Spanish authorities. All this were intended to incite ordinary Americans to hate the Spaniards. This is all part of their plan para pabagsakin ang Spain or the Spanish colony. Next is the explosion of USS Maine. The turning point came on February 15, 1898, when the American battleship USS Maine exploded in the harbor of Havana, Cuba. The explosion killed 246 American sailors, although the exact cause of explosion wasn't clear. The US quickly blamed Spain, stoking the fires of war, fueled or gisilaban. It was not clear, pero it was a very serious incident occurred. The American warship Maine which was anchored at Havana, Cuba, was suddenly blown up, destroying the ship and killing 246 of its crew members. But it was unclear. So, di nila alam kung ano ang totoo. It was made by the Americans. It was all part of their plan, as it was appeal na sa steps. Next is the declaration of war against Spain. On April 21, 1898, the U.S. Congress declared war on Spain, marking the beginning of this Spanish-American War, since the Philippines was Spanish colony. The U.S. military targeted it, intending to destroy the Spanish forces stationed here. The Americans immediately held Spain responsible for the explosion on April 21, 1898. The U.S. Congress declared war against Spain. Since the Philippines was a colony of Spain, the Americans had to go there supposedly to destroy the Spanish forces in the colony. That's how the Americans entered the Philippine scene. Thus, the Americans entered the Philippines as part of their broader strategy to weaken Spain, expand their economic influence, and acquire new territories following the outbreak of the Spanish-American War. This marked the beginning of American involvement in the Philippines, which would eventually lead to Philippine-American War and the colonization of the archipelago. It was part of their plan, no, para pabagsakin ang Spanish. Kaya nga it was part of their plan to enter by making steps, and isa na doon is propaganda, making the Spanish colony be hated by ordinary Americans, and it was part of their plan to enter the Philippine scene.
Good day everyone, I am Jessa Kalamian and I am one of the reporters for Module 9, and today I will be discussing about what was the Treaty of Paris and what was its role in the incorporation of Mindanao, Sulu, and Palawan into the former colony of Spain. This treaty played a crucial role in shaping the history of the Philippines, particularly in how it affected Mindanao and Sulu during Spanish colonization. The early friendship of the American and the Filipino revolutionaries was built on strategic manipulations by the United States. First is pretended friendship, and initially the American positioned themselves as allies to the Filipino revolutionaries, who were primarily Christians led by Emilio Aguinaldo, and the U.S. used this facade to gain trust and cooperation of the Filipino revolutionaries. Second is promises and assurances. The Americans secured Aguinaldo's support by providing independence for the Philippines after Spain was defeated, and this promise aligned with the revolutionaries' goals of ending Spanish colonial rule. So pinangakuan ng mga Amerikano ng independence yung Pilipinas after nila madefeat ang Spanish. But then, what happened next is that after defeating Spain, the U.S. abandoned its promises. This betrayal became evident when the Treaty of Paris in 1898 was signed officially. In the Treaty of Paris, the Spain ceded the Philippines along with Guam and Puerto Rico to the United States. The U.S. paid $20 million for the Philippines, formalizing its claim as a colonial power. The ratification of the Treaty of Paris angered Emilio Aguinaldo and the Filipino revolutionaries who felt betrayed by the Americans. So despite the promises of independence, the treaty transferred the Philippines to U.S. control, replacing Spanish colonization with American rule. So this undermined Filipino aspirations for self-determination and intensified resistance, culminating in the Philippine-American War. So the unfinished Spanish-Moro Wars until 1898, signifying the enduring conflict between Spanish colonizers and the Moro people in the southern Philippines. So this unresolved struggle suggests that the treaty, which formalized Spain's cession of the Philippines to the United States, failed to account for the complexities of local resistance, particularly among the Moro communities who had their own long-standing opposition to foreign domination. 1898, there are three major states existed in what is now the Philippines. First is the Filipinas, and it is historically refers to the territories in the Philippines that were under Spanish control during the colonial period. First is the Luzon. It is the largest and most populous island group which became the political and economic center of the Spanish colonial government. And second is the Visayas, the group of islands in the central Philippines, significant for its cultural and economic contributions during Spanish rule. And parts of northern Mindanao. Certain areas in northern Mindanao were influenced or controlled by the Spanish, though much of Mindanao remained outside full Spanish control due to resistance from local Muslims population. So hindi naman talaga ng population sa Mindanao nasasakop nila at nasasubjugate ng mga Spanish that time. Second is the Maguindanao Sultanate, followed by Sulu Sultanate, and these two prominent Muslim sultanates in the southern Philippines playing significant roles in the history and cultural of Mindanao and its surrounding islands. So, Maguindanao Sultanate is in south central Mindanao, encompassing present-day Maguindanao and neighboring areas. So, it is established in the late 16th century, and it is founded by Sharif Muhammad Kabungsuan and Arab Malay missionaries who introduced Islam to the region in the early 16th century, and it played a crucial role in spreading Islam across Mindanao, and it is known for its resistance against Spanish colonization and established trade and diplomatic relations with neighboring and sultanates. And the third one is the Sulu Sultanate, covered the Sulu archipelago including the islands of Hulu, Basilan, Tawi-Tawi, and parts of eastern Sabah, now Malaysia. So it is founded and established in 1450, and the founder is Sayyid Abu Bakr, an Arab scholar who became the first sultan. And the Sulu Sultanate was a major maritime power controlling trade routes in the region, and it served as a cultural and religious hub for Islam in the Philippines. Like the Maguindanao Sultanate, it resisted Spanish incursions and maintained its independence for centuries, and both sultanates contributed to the Islamic identity of Mindanao and fostered system of governance, trade, and cultural development in the respective territories. So they remain vital to the history of the Muslim population in the Philippines of today. So the last two states is the Sultanates of Maguindanao and Sulu. So it is used to be independent from Filipinas, but when the Spaniards sold the latter, they included the entire Mindanao and Sulu in the business transaction. But then, hindi pumayag ang mga Moro na masali sila sa Treaty of Paris dahil, yun nga, ang Treaty of Paris is that yung mga nasasakupan lang ng Spanish, yung binabayaran nila ng $20 million, but then hindi naman talaga tuluyang nasa-subjugate ng mga Spaniards yung mga Moro, kaya nag-o-object sila dito, but then wala pa rin silang magagawa kasi yun yung kasunduan. And that's all.
Good day everyone, I am Julime Corpus and I will be discussing to you the various stages of the American occupation in the Moroland and how distinct were the American policies in each of the stages. Generally, there were three stages of American occupation in the Moroland. First, military occupation from 1899 to 1903. Second, the Moro province from 1903 to 1913. And third, the Department of Mindanao and Sulu from 1914 to 1920. Military occupation and non-interference policy, 1899 to 1903. The Americans focuses on pacification and colonization. Their primary goal was to establish control over the Philippines, particularly Luzon and Visayas, which were then under the control of Filipino revolutionaries led by Emilio Aguinaldo. For the information of everybody, Emilio Aguinaldo served as the first president at this time. When we say pacification, it means that they had to stop the Filipinos first from fighting back. They also wanted to make the Philippines a part of the United States, which is called colonization. In order to achieve this, they sent soldiers to control the country and fight against Filipino resistance. They built roads, bridges, and schools to help them move around and control the country better. This also helped the Americans to do business and settle in the Philippines. They tried to teach Filipinos about American ways of life and government. The worst part is that they took land from Filipinos to build military bases and for American settlers to live on. While these actions helped the Americans control the Philippines, they also harmed the Filipino people and their way of life. Neutralizing the Muslims. The Americans recognized the potential threat posed by the Muslim population in Mindanao and Sulu and thus sought to neutralize them through a policy of non-provocation and non-interference. The Americans also realized that if the Muslims joined forces with the Filipino revolutionaries who were fighting against American rule, it would significantly complicate their efforts to establish control over the entire archipelago. To avoid provoking the Muslims into armed resistance, the Americans initially adopted a policy of non-provocation and non-interference. This meant avoiding direct military confrontations with the Muslim population and refraining from imposing American rule or cultural values on them. The focus was on establishing friendly relations with Muslim leaders and respecting their autonomy. That's when the Batis Agreement occurred and the non-interference policy was formed. In February 1899, Brigadier General John C. Bates was sent to negotiate with the leaders of Sulu, led by Sultan Jamalul Kiram. The outcome was the Bates Agreement, which aimed to win the friendship of the Moros by convincing them to accept American presence in the region. The Bates Agreement was like a promise between the Americans and the Sultan of Sulu. They wouldn't interfere in how the Muslims live their lives, follow their religion, or made their own rules. The Sultan would still be the leader of the Muslims and the Americans would respect his authority. The question is, why did they make this promise? That's because the Americans didn't want to fight the Muslims. They hoped that by making this promise, the Muslims would stay out of the war against the Americans, but did it work? Not really. Even though they made this promise, the Americans eventually started to interfere more and more in Muslim affairs. This led to problems and conflicts later on. The non-interference policy is just the same as the Bates Agreement. They were both strategies used by the Americans to try to avoid conflict with the Muslim population in Mindanao and Sulu. The only difference is that the Bates Agreement was a specific promise with the Sultan of Sulu that recognized his authority and promised limited American interference in Muslim affairs, while non-interference policy was a broader policy that applied to the entire Muslim religion. It meant that the Americans would generally avoid interfering in Muslim affairs such as their religion, customs, and governance. However, as we've discussed, these policies were not always successful, and the Americans eventually increased their involvement in Muslim affairs, leading to conflict. Important points to note that non-interference policy was primarily a strategy to prevent the Muslim from aligning with the Filipino revolutionaries. While the Americans sought to avoid conflict, they were still establishing their presence and exerting control over the region. The non-interference policy would eventually be abandoned as the Americans sought to consolidate their power and control over the entire archipelago. Moro Province and direct rule in 1903 to 1913. As early as 1901, Emilio Aguinaldo was already captured, and in the following year, 1902, almost all of his generals were either killed, arrested, or had surrendered. Emilio Aguinaldo, the leader of the Philippine Revolution, was captured by U.S. forces on March 23, 1901 in Palanan, Isabela in the northern Philippines. The Philippines had just gained independence from Spain, but the United States took control of the country. Aguinaldo led the fight against the U.S. to keep the Philippines independent. General Frederick Funston, an American general, used a clever trick to capture Aguinaldo. He sent a group of soldiers pretending to be Filipino rebels who wanted to surrender. Aguinaldo trusted them and was captured. Aguinaldo's capture was a major blow to the Filipino resistance. It weakened the fight against the U.S. and made it harder for the Filipinos to win their independence. Aguinaldo's capture is a significant event in Philippine history, making a turning point in the Philippine-American War. Shift from non-interference to direct rule. The Americans abandoned the non-interference policy and adopted direct rule over the Muslim-majority regions of the Philippines, which were collectively known as the Moro Province. Imagine the Americans in the Philippines like parents with a teenager. At first, the parents were lax. They let the teenager make their own decisions and do what they wanted to do. This is like the non-interference policy. But then, things started to go wrong. The teenager might have gotten into trouble or made bad choices. So the parents decided to take control. They started to making all the rules and telling the teenager what to do. This is like the direct rule. Similarly, the Americans initially tried to let the Muslims in Mindanao and Sulu govern themselves. However, they felt that this wasn't working. So they decided to take more control and directly rule over these regions. This meant that the Americans made all the important decisions and imposed their own laws and rules on the Muslims. They had more control over how the Muslims lived. This change in policy had a big impact on the lives of the Muslims in Mindanao and Sulu. Establishment of the Moro Province in 1903. The Philippine Commission Act 787 created the Moro Province, placing all Moro or Muslim districts under the direct American military control. Imagine the Philippines like a big country with different regions. The Americans wanted to control a specific part of the Philippines where many Muslims lived called Mindanao and Sulu. They created a special region called the Moro Province. It was like creating a separate country within the Philippines but still under American control. The Americans put the military in charge. Instead of letting local leaders govern, the Americans put their own military officers in charge of the Moro Province. This was a big change because it meant that the Americans were directly ruling over the Muslims instead of letting them govern themselves. Military-civilian administration. The Moro Province was characterized by a blend of military power and civil procedures. American administrators, often with military backgrounds, governed the region. Let me give you an example. Imagine the Moro Province like a school. Usually, teachers run the school. They make the rules and decide how things are done. This is like a civilian administration. But in the Moro Province, it was like having both teachers and soldiers running the school. The teachers would make some of the rules, but the soldiers would be there to keep order and make sure everyone followed the rules. The Americans who ruled the province were often former soldiers. They used both military power and regular government methods to control the region. This meant that while there were rules and laws like in any government, the military was always there to enforce them and maintain control. The Americans wanted to make sure everyone obeyed the rules, and they used both the power of the government and the power of the military to achieve this. Tribal ward system. The natives were organized into a tribal ward system where the chieftain of each ward was responsible for the actions of his constituents. The Americans created a system where the leaders of small groups within the villages were held responsible for the actions of the people in their groups. This was a way for the Americans to control the people more easily. If someone did something wrong, the Americans could punish the leader of their group instead of having to find and punish each individual person. This system had both good and bad aspects. On one hand, it made it easier for the Americans to maintain order. On the other hand, it put a lot of pressure on the leaders and could create conflict within the communities. District organization. The Moro Province was divided into districts. Davao, now composed of Davao Oriental, Davao del Norte, Davao del Sur, and Compostela Valley, which is already known as Davao de Oro. Cotabato now includes North Cotabato, South Cotabato, Sultan Kudarat, Maguindanao, and Sarangani. Lanao, which is composed of Lanao del Norte and Lanao del Sur. Zamboanga, Zamboanga del Norte, Zamboanga del Sur, and Zamboanga Sibugay. And Sulu, partitioned into Basilan, Sulu, and Tawi-Tawi. Each district was headed by an American district governor. This means that the governors had a lot of power within their districts and they were responsible for making sure the Americans' rules were followed. They also had to deal with local issues and problems within their districts. This system of district helped the Americans to better control the Moro province. By dividing the region into smaller areas, they could more easily manage and govern the Muslim population. Policies that interfered with Moro lifestyle. The Americans implemented policies that directly impacted the Moros' way of life, including taxation, imposing of taxes on the Moro population, anti-slavery law, banning of slavery among the Moros, and disarmament policy making the carrying of traditional bladed weapons illegal. These policies were like trying to change how a family lives by forcing them to eat different food, stop doing things they've always done, and take away their favorite toys. The Moros felt that the Americans were trying to force them to change their way of life, which they didn't like. It's important to remember that these policies were implemented with the goal of bringing the Moros into the American system of governance. However, they had a significant impact on Moro society and culture, leading to resentment and resistance. So the violent reactions of the Moros or Muslims in Mindanao and Sulu to American policies during the Moro province period in 1903 to 1913. American policies generated resistance. The American policies such as taxation, anti-slavery laws, and disarmament were seen as infringements on the Moros' way of life and lead to violent resistance. These policies made the Moros feel like the Americans were trying to control every aspect of their lives and take away their freedom. The Moros felt that the Americans were imposing their own rules and values on them without considering their own customs and traditions. This created a sense of injustice and resentment. As a result, the Moros resisted these policies in various ways, including armed rebellion. There were several uprisings and conflicts between the Moros and the American forces during this period. So the key battles or the massacres that happened during this. The several significant battles and massacres that occurred during this period, including Bacolod Grande and Cotabato in 1903, Taraca in 1907, Buddadjo in 1907, and Budbagsak in 1913. These events highlight the violent conflict that arose due to the American policies and the Moro resistance. Bacolod Grande and Cotabato in 1903, these were early confrontations between American forces and Moro resistance groups. They demonstrated the growing tensions and the potential for widespread conflict. Taraca in 1907, this was a major battle where American forces attacked and destroyed the Moro stronghold of Taraca in Sulu. This battle resulted in significant casualties on both sides and further inflamed tensions between the Moros and the Americans. Buddadjo in 1907. This was a particularly tragic event. American forces launched an assault on a heavily fortified Moro position on Mount Buddadjo in Sulu. The resulting battle led to a large number of Moro casualties, including women and children. This event remains a controversial and painful episode in Philippine history. Budbagsak in 1913. This was another major battle in Sulu where American forces again clashed with Moro resistance. It resulted in significant casualties on both sides and further weakened Moro resistance in the region. These battles and massacres highlight the violent nature of the American colonization of the Philippines and the significant human cost of the conflict. They serve as a reminder of the importance of understanding and acknowledging the historical trauma experienced by the Moro people. American military superiority. The Americans ultimately used their superior military power to suppress Moro resistance. In terms of modern weapons, the Americans possessed superior weaponry, including modern rifles, artillery, and machine guns. The Moros, on the other hand, were primarily armed with traditional weapons like swords, spears, and bladed weapons. In terms of military training and tactics, the American military was well trained and experienced in modern warfare tactics. They had access to better training, logistics, and communication systems. The Americans also had a strong naval presence in the region, allowing them to easily transport troops and supplies and maintain control of key sea routes. This military superiority allowed the Americans to eventually suppress Moro resistance, while the Moros fought bravely and inflicted casualties on American forces. They were ultimately unable to overcome the overwhelming military power of the United States. Centralized Philippine colony. The American suppression of Moro resistance contributed to the creation of a highly centralized and unitary Philippine colony, bringing together the people of Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao under American rule. For example, imagine trying to build a house. If one part of the house is constantly resisting, it's difficult to build a strong and stable structure. By suppressing Moro resistance, the Americans were able to build a stronger and more unified Philippine colony under their control. However, it's important to note that this unity was imposed by the Americans. It did not necessarily reflect the true desires of or aspirations of all the different groups within the Philippines. Next is the Juramentados. Juramentados were Moros who swore to kill as many invaders as they could before they would die. Those were the individuals who had sworn on oath to their faith and their people. This oath bound them to fight bravely and fiercely against the Americans, even if it meant sacrificing their own lives. The emphasis was not on victory or survival, but on inflicting as much damage on the enemy as possible before dying. Juramentados were feared by the American forces. Their willingness to fight to the death made them formidable opponents. As you can see, this is the administrative structure of the Moro province. Here's the breakdown of the structure. Insular government. At the top was the insular government based in Manila, which oversaw the entire Philippines. This included the Governor General and the Philippine Commission. It was the highest level of government in the Philippines during the American colonial period. It had the power to make decisions and control the entire country. Next is the Moro province government. Below the insular government was the Moro province government. It was headed by a governor and a legislative commission. This level was responsible for administering the entire Moro province. The Moro province government was like the principal's office for just this special section. It had its own leader, the governor, who was like the head of the section. It also had a group of people who helped make decisions, like a student council. This was the legislative commission. The Moro province government was in charge of everything that happened within the Moro province. They made the rules, solved problems, and made sure things ran smoothly within that specific region. Under that is the districts. The Moro province was divided into several districts: Davao, Cotabato, Lanao, Sulu, and Zamboanga. Each district had a district governor and a district board. This level was responsible for administering the specific areas within each district. The districts were like smaller units within the Moro province. Each district had its own manager. This manager was the district governor. The manager had a team to help him run the district. This team was the district board. So what did these managers do? They were in charge of everything that happened within their specific district. They made sure the rules were followed and that everything was running smoothly. They also helped to solve problems and deal with any issues that arose within their district. Next is the municipalities and tribal wards. Further down, there were municipalities within each district. Within municipalities, there were tribal wards. The tribal ward system was a way to organize the local population, with each ward led by a chieftain or the datu. So, next we'll be tackling the Moro problem during the American colonial period in the Philippines. So, coining of the term Moro problem was coined during this period to describe the challenges faced by the U.S. in governing the Muslim-majority regions of Mindanao and Sulu. Comparison to American Indians, the U.S. military viewed the Moros similarly to how they viewed Native Americans in the West, believing that brute force was necessary to subdue them. In Najib Salibi's definition, Najib Salibi was the one who served as superintendent of public schools in the Moro province, defined the Moro problem as a challenge of administering the Moros as they were being integrated into the larger Philippine nation. He believed that the Moro problem was about helping the Muslims understand and adapt to American rule. He wanted to guide them and help them become a part of the larger Philippine nation, just like students learning in a school. Advancement in culture and civilization. Salibi believed that administering the Moros entailed bringing them to a higher level of culture and civilization, reflecting the paternalistic and assimilationist views of the time. He believed that the Moros needed to change and become more like Americans. He thought they needed to learn American ways, adapt American culture, and become more civilized according to American standards. It's important to remember that these views were common during the time of American colonialism. However, they are now considered to be insensitive and disrespectful of other cultures. Mindanao problem, some people use the term Mindanao problem as a more neutral alternative to Moro problem. Others felt that the term Moro problem was not fair or respectful to the Muslim people, so they started using the term Mindanao problem instead. This term was more general and didn't directly refer to the Muslims. However, even the term Mindanao problem still implied that there was something wrong or difficult about that region. So that would be all. Thank you for watching.
What is the goal of self-government? The Benevolent Assimilation Proclamation hinted at the future where Filipinos would exercise self-government and eventually gain independence. So a closer look at the meaningful and Assimilation Proclamation would reveal that Americans and Mindanao and Sulu, including the Philippinization, were looking forward to a date in the future when Filipinos would exercise self-government and eventually become independent. So, next we have the Democrats' influence. The Democrats, upon winning in 1930, accelerated the move towards self-government and independence. All of you started to come true when the Democrats desired to accelerate to more self-government and independence for the Philippines. And for the transfer of control, gradually the Democrats would transfer the control of the insular government from the American to the Filipino. This policy was known as Filipinization. So the insular government of the Philippine Islands was an essential government that governed the incorporated U.S. territory of the Philippine Islands. So then the Agency of Mindanao and Sulu was implemented. So part of the Filipinization program is to abolish the Moro provinces that championed direct rule. So we already know that direct rule is that the Moro who champion the direct rule, they have their right to govern their own territory. So on the other hand, Moro provinces will have their own system of government since they champion direct rule, meaning they would make their own system of governance without the need or without being governed by the central government. So because of the direct rule won by the Moro province, here comes the reorganization. So in 1913, the Moro province was reorganized into the Department of Mindanao and Sulu. Under the department, the former districts of Moro province were restructured. The Moro provinces would be organized into the Department of Mindanao and Sulu under the Department of the former districts of the Moro province plus the new provinces of Agusan and Bukidnon. So here is the structure of the Moro provinces. So first is administrative structure. The Department of Mindanao and Sulu had a hierarchical structure composed of insular government, consists of Governor General or the Philippine Commission, Department of Mindanao and Sulu, the Department Governor, provincial governments consist of Agusan, Bukidnon, Davao, Cotabato, Lanao, Sulu, and Zamboanga. So these are the provinces of Moro. So we also have the municipalities and districts within each province. So let's proceed to the Moro resentment. The limited Filipino term Filipino in the Filipinization program was often used to refer exclusively to Christian Filipinos, excluding Moros. So this exclusion caused Moro resentment towards the Filipinization program as it did not include them in the process of self-governance. So, as pointed out already, Filipinization of colonial administration would be pursued under the Department of Mindanao and Sulu. Accordingly, Filipino officials assumed the greater responsibilities on the governance of Moro land. However, the term Filipino in the Filipinization program appeared to be almost exclusive to Christian Filipinos. Thus, the Filipinization program that was vigorously pursued under the department even caused more resentments instead of more enthusiasm, participation, and excitement. This means that Filipinization had made Moros feeling of upset because of forcing them to accept of what they don't like. So instead of participating in any national government programs, any of the government programs, they tend to rebuild. Imagine when your own position is being governed by others and they are superior. So where in fact the Moro people did not agree with that system. So Sultan Alauyo Lonto expressed his dissatisfaction with the Filipinization program, highlighting the exclusion of Moros. With that, he said the Moro people want to set their house in order, but how can they when the very key of their house is not their possession? Perhaps the Moro may be locked in or locked out because the key to their own doors is not in their hands. So this is ended at tragedy. Those of you who are not accustomed to the native son of the province conducting the affairs of your own people will surely understand what it means to be governed by outsiders and intruders who do not have even command of the dialect of the people to be governed. So who is that personality? So Alauyo Alonto was a Muslim. So actually, Alauyo Alonto was a Muslim Filipino politician from Lanao, best known for being a delegate to the Constitutional Convention of 1944 and a two-term senator of the Philippines serving from 1945 to 1949. Simply, what he meant by his statement was pronounced against the political backdrop where Christian Filipinos from the north were appointed in key positions in the government of the Moro land. So next, let's proceed to the Moro leadership in Christian hands. Moros felt excluded from their own governance. So when Christian Filipinos from the north were appointed to key positions in the government of Moro land, so meaning the Moros, they don't have rights to govern their own territory since the Christian Filipinos were appointed in key positions to govern their territory. So, the Philippinization, the continuation of Philippinization. In any case of Philippinization program of the administration under the Department of Mindanao and Sulu would continue whether the Moros were happy about it or not. So it is how unfair treatment is, or then that despite of resentment, so the continuation of Philippinization. In any case, the Philippinization program of the administration under the Department of Mindanao and Sulu would continue whether the Moros were happy about it or not. So that how unfair the government was during the American colonization at the same time. So despite of resentment, the Philippinization continued. So under the Department of Mindanao and Sulu, regardless of Moro approval. So transferred to Bureau of Non-Christian Tribes, so that was in 1920. So the department was abolished and Moro affairs were placed under the Bureau of Non-Christian Tribes, further solidifying Christian Filipino control. So the question is, what made the Filipinos accept to be used under the jurisdiction of the U.S. colonial system? So aside from serving as a training ground to acquire the civilization, according to President William McKinley in the Benevolent Assimilation Proclamation, so the U.S. has also a policy of attraction wherein the American government implemented programs to mitigate the negative effect of colonialism and to address moral resentment. So we have here, the number one policy is the free education. Free education was made compulsory, with each Moro family required to send at least one child to school. So the American colonial period had brought great contributions. So as we know already, that American colonization had brought a great or a huge contributions to our country, particularly in education system development. Free education was institutionalized and public schools were established almost everywhere in Moro districts. So however, it was said that some of the royal families, especially in Lanao, were so afraid to vet education of their children under the Christian Americans, as it would mean that children to be converted to Christianity. So thus, instead of sending their own children to school, they sent the sons and daughters of their slaves. Somehow or true to all, it is inevitable that the social factors could really influence in child's development. That's why instead of sending their children to school, they sent their slaves, daughter and sons. Later, these slaves' children will become professionals and among the first to qualify in every important post in the government. So aside from education, pensionado program was also implemented. So the government established the pensionado program, sending non-Christian natives to Manila and America for higher learning or educational tours, improve healthcare and infrastructure, so which include hospitals, dispensaries, roads and trails were built to improve healthcare and connectivity for Moros. As what Peter Going said, hospital and field dispensaries were also provided in such a number that medical care came within the reach of nearly all the inhabitants. Public works were greatly expanded, hundreds of kilometers of new routes and trails, ended the isolation of thousands of inhabitants and brought them into contact with commercial and governmental centers. Also, one of the policies of attraction imposed by Americans was the increased participation in government. Moros were given greater participation in local and provincial governments, with some even appointed to Philippine legislature. The Muslims were given highly elevated participation in local and provincial government. Later, some were even in the appointed to the Philippine legislature. Muslim leaders were periodically taken to Manila as guests of the government so that they would be apostles of peace and be even more cooperative with government officials. So the increased population or the increased participation in government is also one of the policies made by US, as I mentioned a while ago. So furthermore, agricultural sector was also prioritized in the American colonization. So agricultural colonies, specifically in Cotabato province. So Muslim families they participated in agricultural colonies established by the government, promoting intergroup living and land development. So I think that would be all for my report. Thank you for watching.
Hello everyone. Now I am going to discuss how did American policy or practice contribute to the present Mindanao problem. So the ongoing conflict in Mindanao, Philippines, a region with a significant Muslim population, has deep historical roots intricately linked to the legacy of American colonialism. While often overlooked, the United States policies and practices during its occupation of the Philippines played a crucial role in shaping the present-day challenges in Mindanao. This report will examine four key aspects of American involvement: a forcible incorporation of Mindanao and Sulu into the Philippine colony, the resettlement of Christian Filipinos in Mindanao, the implementation of discriminatory land laws, and the attempted annexation of Mindanao as a U.S. territory. By analyzing these historical actions, we aim to understand how American policies exacerbated existing tensions, created new divisions, and ultimately contributed to the complex and enduring conflict in Mindanao. So how did American policy or practice contribute to the present Mindanao problem? We see four major contributions of United States policy to the Mindanao problem. First, we forcible incorporation of Mindanao and Sulu into the Philippine colony. Second, the resettling of Christian natives on Mindanao. Third, the discriminatory land laws. And lastly, the attempt to annex Mindanao, Sulu, and Palawan into U.S. territory. The Mindanao problem refers to the ongoing conflict in the Philippines, particularly in the southern region of Mindanao, which is home to a significant Muslim population. The contributions of United States policy to this issue can be traced back to the U.S. colonial period in the Philippines, following the Spanish-American War. Now, let us explore the four major contributions of United States policy to the Mindanao problem. First, we have forcible incorporation of Mindanao and Sulu. The Treaty of Paris in 1898 resulted the United States annexing territories in the Philippines, including Maguindanao, Maranao, and Sulu, which were previously independent. The Treaty of Paris was signed in 1898, marking the end of Spanish-American War and resulting in the transfer of Philippine territories to the United States. Among these territories were Maguindanao, Maranao, and Sulu. which had previously enjoyed sovereignty and were considered independent entities. This transition marked the beginning of significant political changes in the region, disrupting the established governance and autonomy of these groups. So the annexation forcibly subjugated the Moro peoples, incorporating them into a predominantly Christian Philippines. The annexation of these territories by United States served to forcibly subjugate the Moro peoples, a collective term for the Muslims group in these areas, who were distinguished from the predominantly Christian populace of the Philippines. This incorporation of Maguindanao, Maranao, and Sulu into the new political framework under U.S. governance effectively diminished their autonomy. United States stuck out three independences from three sovereign states when she signed the Treaty of Paris in 1898. She took away not only the Aguinaldos Republican ng Pilipinas but also the Sultanates of Maguindanao and Sulu and Maranao Pingampong, the first Philippine Republic proclaimed by Emilio Aguinaldo, which sought independence from colonial rule. So the Sultanates of Maguindanao and Sulu established systems of governance with rich histories and cultural identities. And the Maranao Pingampong is another independent political entity that played a significant role in the regional governance. This forced incorporation led to tensions and conflicts as the Moro peoples resisted the loss of their autonomy and cultural identity. Upon granting independence in 1946, the U.S. recognized only one Philippines, neglecting the distinct identities of Maguindanao, Sulu, and Maranao, thereby merging multiple nations into a single state comprising Muslims, Christians, and Lumads. When the United States granted independence to the Philippines in 1946, it recognized a single unified state, disregarding the unique identities and historical context of Maguindanao, Sulu, and Maranao. This decision effectively merged multiple nations, each with its own cultural, political, and social dynamics, into one state. Consequently, the new Philippine Republic consisted of diverse groups including Muslims, Christians, and Lumads, or the indigenous peoples. Yet, the national identity emphasized a singular narrative that overlooked the complexities of the different communities. So after the subjugation of the Moros, the American colonial government initiated a resettlement scheme in 1912, targeting landless farmers from Luzon and Visayas to move to Mindanao. This was designed to address agrarian unrest linked to Spain's hacienda system and promote unity between Christian Filipinos and Moros. Secondly, we have resettling Christian natives on Mindanao. So after the subjugation of the Moros, the Americans introduced in 1912 the idea of resettling landless but industrious farmers from Luzon and Visayas on Mindanao. So the traditional hacienda system, or the inequitable distribution of land in the north, which had been established by the Spaniards, the initiative aimed to address agrarian unrest in Luzon and Visayas, which were plagued by an uneven land distribution system, or known as the hacienda system, a legacy of Spanish colonialism. So the American colonial government encouraged settlers to extend the giving them free transportation, financial and legal assistance, farm tools, and other implements. The Americans had to lure the corn-loving Cebuanos with hybrid American corn, and somehow tell them that this was the corn of Mindanao, so that if they wanted it, they should go to Mindanao to raise it there. So these efforts, though well-intentioned, began a systematic agrarian program called Moro colonies, also agricultural colonies, which American administrations under General John Pershing and Frank Carpenter established in the Cotabato Valley and in Lanao. 26 such colonies were established in Pikit, Piudupulangi, Pagulangan, and Glan Cotabato and Bumungan in Lanao, the latter having been reserved for destitute Americans with Filipino wives. American contributed to the present problem. They introduced the idea of bringing Christian settlers to Mindanao. The American colonial government implemented a policy to bring Christian settlers to Mindanao, believing that their presence would facilitate agricultural development and enhance economic productivity. So this initiative was part of a broader strategy to civilize the region, which they viewed as underdeveloped. These settlers were granted significant tracts of land by the colonial government, often leading to the displacement of indigenous population. This policy shifted the demographic landscape of Mindanao, introducing tensions that had not existed at the same scale previously. Under Spanish rule, violence between Muslims and Christians was largely psychological with limited physical encounters. And also during the Spanish rule, the interaction between Muslim and Christian population in Mindanao was dominated by psychological conflicts. While there were military expeditions, actual violence was relatively rare. Most of the conflicts stemmed from the cultural and religious differences rather than direct engagement. During the Spanish period, the violence between Muslim and Christian population was largely psychological. Both settlers and indigenous population were unaware of the rules as victims of colonial decisions. Christian settlers nor the indigenous populations fully recognized that they were both victims of colonial policies. The settlers may have believed that arrival was justified and beneficial, while the local population were coping with the disruption caused by these new policies. The third is we have discriminatory land laws. So the Moros did not dislike only the coming of Christianized natives from Luzon and Visayas, but also the passing of several discriminatory land laws. And these laws included the Act number 496 of 1902, otherwise known as the Land Registration Act. This act required that the application for land registration of title shall be in writing, signed and sworn to be that the application that this law was implement dates. In Cotabato, the first school that applicant notes were established in 1903 inside military camps for Moros who wanted to serve the American Army. Lanao had literacy schools for Moro soldiers only in 1904. Other areas of Minsopala would follow at a much later date. Other regions in Mindanao or the Minsopala received such educational opportunities much later. So while this act attempted to regulate land ownership, inadvertently marginalized many indigenous people who lack knowledge of the legal processes and language barriers, leaving them vulnerable of losing their land. So secondly, we have the Act of 718 of 1903. This law declared null and void all land grants made by Moro datos, sultans, and chiefs of non-Christian tribes when made without government authority and consent. This effectively invalidated the traditional land ownership systems and rights of Moros and Blumads, stripping them of their historical claims to land and rendering their agreements with local leaders meaningless in the eyes of the colonial government. in the eyes of the colonial government. So next is we have the Act of 926 of 903, Public Land Act. This act declared as public lands all lands not registered under Act number 496 of 1902. Under this law, public lands were to be disposed of in three ways: by homestead, purchase, or by individual or corporation, and less. Under this act, many indigenous groups found themselves depossessed since their lands were considered unregistered. These complexities of legal lands registration often left them competing for land they had traditionally owned, but now had to navigate a bureaucratic process they were largely unfamiliar with. Next is the Mining Law of 1905. This law declared all public lands in the Philippines are free, open for exploration, occupation, and purchase by citizens of the Philippines and the United States. This law further threatened indigenous lands as it allowed external entities, mainly American interests, to exploit land for resources without regard for local ownership or rights. It exacerbated the marginalization of Moros and Lumads as their lands could easily be claimed in the name of economic development. The Next is we have the Cadastral Act of 1907. This law was designed to facilitate the acquisition of next land holdings. It was believed to have allowed educated natives or the Indios and non-Indios, bureaucrats and American land speculators who were more familiar with the bureaucratic process to legalize claims usurped through fraudulent surveys, aimed to simplify the process of claiming land, ostensibly to help foster legal ownership. However, it favored individuals familiar with bureaucratic practices such as educated natives and American land speculators, allowing for the continuation of fraudulent land claims and further marginalizing those without resources or education to claim their rightfully held lands. Next is we have the Act of 2874 of 1919. This law allowed Christian settlers to homestead 24 hectares while non-Christians were only allowed 10 hectares. Corporations were allowed 1,024 hectares. This act institutionalized inequality in land distribution, privileging Christian settlers while further marginalizing non-Christian population, reinforcing social divisions and economic disparities. As a consequence of these laws, many of the Moros and Lumads would be marginalized and alienated. The Land Registration Act of 1902 and Public Land Act of 1903, in particular, were responsible for turning many of the natives into the squatters on their own lands. Aside from the fact that many of them were ignorant in the process of land registering and titling, the government did not exert enough effort to assist the Moros and Lumads to acquire titles to the lands they were occupying. Last is making Mindanao part of the U.S. territory. The American colonial policy was inconsistent regarding Mindanao. The situation regarding Mindanao and its governance during the American colonial period reflects a complex interplay of policy, power dynamics, and perceptions of governance capability. Despite being officially incorporated into the Philippine Islands following the Treaty of Paris, there were persistent undercurrents suggesting a desire among some American officials and capitalists to establish Mindanao as a permanent territory of the United States. So Mindanao was included in the Philippine Islands under the Treaty of Paris, but there were indications of interest in making it a permanent U.S. territory. The American administration in the Moro province led to increased interest from officials and capitalists in incorporating Mindanao as U.S. territory. In 1906, American planters supported by officials began petitioning for Mindanao's incorporation into the U.S. The administration of the Moro province, which encompasses Mindanao, played a significant role in shaping these aspirations. Beginning in 1906, American planters in the region, with the support of government officials, began advocating for for the incorporation of Mindanao into the United States. These efforts was motivated by various factors including economic interests in the region and the belief in the superiority of American governance over that of the Filipinos. Colonel Ralph Hoyt is the acting governor of the Moro province, expressed in 1909 the recommendation to segregate Mindanao from the Philippines and declare it a U.S. territory, focusing on coaling stations and military governance. So he explicitly articulated this viewpoint in his 1909 annual report. He suggested that Mindanao should be segregated from the broader Philippine governance and instead be given a status similar to a U.S. territory with a structure that combined military and civil administration. His recommendation highlighted an underlying belief that local governance was unsuitable, advocating for American control as a more stable alternative. High U.S. officials' missions to the Philippines, including Secretary Dickinson in 1910, the Forbes mission in 1921, and Thompson in 1926, supported the idea that Americans were better suited to govern the Moros than Filipinos. Views included claims that Filipinos were unfit for self-government and that Moros preferred continued American rule. And some Moros petitioned during this time aimed for incorporation into the U.S. rather than the Philippines. Effects of this situation included hindering to push for Philippine independence and reinforcing the narrative of Filipinos' political immaturity. So the political climate in the Philippines from 1921 to 1927 under Governor General Leonard Wood favored continued American control and a reversal of the Philippinization program. By the mid-1920s, the political landscape under Governor General Leonard Wood further shifted to favor ongoing American domination over the islands. The reversal of the Philippinization program during this period signaled a reluctance to devolve governance to local leaders, reinforcing the narrative of American responsibility for stabilizing the region and managing its affairs. So the push for the annexation of Mindanao peaked around 1926. So on June 21, 1926, Congressman Robert Bacon introduced a bill to remove the Moro province from Philippine jurisdiction and establish direct U.S. control. So the movement for the annexation of Mindanao during the 1920s represent a significant chapter in the complex history of American colonial rule in the Philippines. The push for annexation reached its zenith in 1926 when the U.S. Congressman Robert Bacon introduced a bill aimed at removing the Moro province from the jurisdiction of the Philippine government. So the proposed legislation sought to establish a distinct form of administration directly under U.S. control. This aim reflected a broader concern among some African officials about effectively managing the region, which was seen as a potential liability due to its political and cultural complexities. After the Bacon bills stagnated, additional bills H.R. 12772 and H.R. 15479 were proposed to annex Mindanao, excluding the Bacon bills focused on the Sulu Archipelago and Muslim province in Misamis province and Palawan into U.S. territory. Following Bacon's bill, other legislative proposals, specifically HR 12772 and HR 15479, were introduced, aiming not only to permanently annex Mindanao but also to include the Sulu Archipelago and Palawan as part of U.S. territory. The rationale of these efforts included the desire to lessen dependence on imported goods and develop agriculture in the region. However, both the initial Bacon Bill and the subsequent proposal failed to gain traction despite some support from American interest. Keep on plantation development. These movements aim to reduce the U.S. reliance on imports while simultaneously detaching the region from the Philippines' path towards independence. There was speculation that Mindanao could have become the 50th state of the USA, paralleling Hawaii and the Philippines, both annexed in 1898. These efforts towards annexation were protests from Filipinos nationalists and overarching U.S. policies like the Jones Act of 1916, which sought eventual independence for the Philippines. The failed annexation attempts reinforced division between Moros and Christians Filipinos during this period. So Frank Carpenter is the governor of the department, suggested that American interest in Mindanao fostered a unique separatist movement which was primarily driven by American planters rather than the Moro people themselves. Historian Pelzer noted that American advocates for separation exploited differences and antagonism between Christian and non-Christian Filipinos. So the annexation efforts had lasting implications for the relationship between Moros or the Muslim Filipinos and Christian Filipinos, reinforcing division that were already pronounced. The described attempts at separation also gave rise to a distinctive separatist sentiment among the Moro population, but interestingly, this movement was primarily nurtured by American planters and officials rather than originating from the Moros themselves. American interest tended to exploit existing divisions, further complicating relationships between the two communities and planting the seeds for future conflicts. So that's all, and thank you.